Holes, Chapter 30. The next day was Zig Zag's birthday, or so he said. Zig Zag lay in his cot as everyone headed outside. I get to sleep in because it's my birthday. Then a little while later, he cut into the breakfast line just in front of Squid. Squid told him to go to the end of the line. Hey, it's my birthday, Zig Zag said, staying where he was. It's not your birthday, said Magnet, who was standing behind Squid. Is too, said Zig Zag, July 8th. Stanley was behind Magnet. He didn't know what day of the week it was, let alone the date. It could have been July 8th, but how would Zig Zag know? He tried to figure out how long he'd been at Camp Green Lake. If indeed it was July 8th. He came here on May 24th, he said aloud. So that means I've been here 46 days, said Zero. Stanley was still trying to remember how many days there were in May and June. He looked at Zero. He'd learned not to doubt him when it came to math. 46 days. It felt more like 1,000. He didn't dig a hole the first day, and he hadn't dug one yet today. That meant he dug 46 holes if it really was July 8th. Can I have an extra carton of juice? Zig Zag asked Mr. Sir. It's my birthday. To everyone's surprise, Mr. Sir gave it to him. Stanley dug his shovel into the dirt. Hole number 45. The 45th hole is the hardest, he said to himself. But that really wasn't true. And he knew it. He was a lot stronger than when he first arrived. His body had adjusted somewhat to the heat and the harsh conditions. Mr. Sir was no longer depriving him of water, meaning not giving him water. After having to get by on less water for a week or so, Stanley now felt like he had all the water that he could want. Of course, it helped that Zero dug some of his hole for him each day, but that wasn't as great as everyone thought it was. He always felt awkward while Stanley was digging his hole, unsure of what to do with himself. Usually, he stood around a while before sitting off by himself on the hard ground with the sun beating down on him. It was better than digging, but not a lot better. When the sun came up a couple hours later, Stanley looked for the thumb of God. The mountains were little more than dark shadows on the horizon. He thought he could make out a spot where the top of one of the mountains seemed to jut upwards, but it didn't seem very impressive. A short time later, the mountains were no longer visible, hidden behind the glare of the sun, reflecting off the dirty air. It was possible, he realized, that he was somewhere near where Kate Barlow had robbed his great-grandfather. If that was really her lipstick tube that he'd found, then she must have lived somewhere around here. Zero took his turn before a lunch break. Stanley climbed out of his hole and Zero climbed down into it. Hey, caveman, said Zig Zag, you should get a whip. Then if your slave doesn't dig fast enough, you can crack it across his back. He's not my slave, said Stanley. We have a deal, that's all. A good deal for you, said Zig Zag. It was Zero's idea, not mine. Don't you know, Zig, said X-Ray coming over. Caveman's doing Zero a big favor. Zero likes to dig holes. He sure is a nice guy to let Zero dig his hole for him, said Squid. Well, what about me, asked Armpit. I like to dig holes, too. Can I dig for you, Caveman? After Zero's finished? The other boys laughed. No, I want to, said Zig Zag. It's my birthday. Stanley tried his best to ignore them. Zig Zag kept at it. Come on, Caveman, be a pal. Let me dig your hole. Stanley smiled, as if it were all a big joke. Mr. Pendanski arrived with water and lunch. Zig Zag offered Stanley his place in line. Since you're so much better than me. Stanley remained where he was. I didn't say I was bad. You're insulting him, Zig, said X-Ray. Why should Caveman take your place when he deserves to be at the very front? He's better than all of us, aren't you, Caveman? No, said Stanley. Sure you are, said X-Ray. Now come to the front of the line where you belong. That's okay, said Stanley. No, it's not, said X-Ray. Get up here. Stanley hesitated, then moved to the front of the line. Well, this is a first, Mr. Pendanski said, coming around the side of the truck. He filled Stanley's canteen and handed him a sack lunch. Stanley was glad to get away. He sat down between his hole and Zero's. He was glad that he'd be digging his own hole for the rest of the day. Maybe the other boys would leave him alone. Maybe he shouldn't let Zero dig his hole for him anymore. But he needed to save his energy to be a good teacher. He bit into his sandwich, which contained some kind of a meat and cheese mixture that came in a can. Just about everything at Green Lake came in a can. The supply truck came once a month. He glanced up to see Zig Zag and Squid walking toward him. Uh-oh. I'll give you my cookie if you let me dig your hole, said Zig Zag. Squid laughed. Here, take my cookie, said Zig Zag, holding it out for him. No, thanks, said Stanley. Come on, take my cookie, said Zig Zag, sticking it in his face. Leave me alone, said Stanley. Please, eat my cookie, said Zig Zag, holding it under Stanley's nose. Squid laughed. Stanley pushed it away. Zig Zag pushed him back. Don't push me. I didn't. Stanley got to his feet. He looked around. Mr. Pendanski was filling Zero's canteen. Zig Zag pushed him again. I said don't push me. Stanley took a step backward, carefully avoiding Zero's hole. Zig Zag kept after him. He shoved Stanley and said, quit pushing. Lay off, said Armpit, as he, Magnet, and X-Ray joined them. Why should he? Snapped X-Ray. Caveman's bigger. He can take care of himself. I don't want any trouble, Stanley said. Zig Zag pushed him hard. Eat my cookie, he said. Stanley was glad to see Mr. Pendanski coming toward them, along with Zero. Hi, Mom, said Armpit. We're just fooling around. I saw what was going on, Mr. Pendanski said. He turned to Stanley. Go ahead, Stanley, he said. Hit him back. You're bigger. Stanley stared at Mr. Pendanski in astonishment. He couldn't believe it. Teach the bully a lesson, said Mr. Pendanski. Zig Zag hit Stanley on the shoulder with his open hand. Teach me a lesson, he challenged. Stanley made a feeble, like a weak attempt to punch Zig Zag. Then he felt a flurry of fists against his head and neck. Zig Zag had hold of his collar with one hand and was hitting him with the other. The collar ripped and Stanley fell backwards into the dirt. That's enough, Mr. Pendanski yelled. It wasn't enough for Zig Zag. He jumped on top of Stanley. Stop, shouted Mr. Pendanski. The side of Stanley's face was pressed flat against the dirt. He tried to protect himself, but Zig Zag's fist slammed off his arms and pounded his face into the ground. All he could do was wait for it to be over. Then suddenly, Zig Zag was off of him. Stanley managed to look up, and he saw Zero had his arm around Zig Zag's neck. Zig Zag made a gagging sound, because he couldn't breathe, as he desperately tried to pry Zero's arm off of him. You're going to kill him, shouted Mr. Pendanski. Zero kept squeezing. Armpit charged into them, freeing Zig Zag from Zero's chokehold. The three boys fell to the ground in different directions. Mr. Pendanski fired his pistol into the air. The other counselors came running from the office, the tents, or out on the lake. They had their guns drawn, meaning they pulled them out, but holstered them, put them back in when they saw the trouble was over. The warden walked over from her cabin. There was a riot, Mr. Pendanski told her. Zero almost strangled Riggy. The warden looked at Zig Zag, who was still stretching and massaging his neck. Then she turned her attention to Stanley, who was obviously in the worst condition. What happened to you? Nothing. It wasn't a riot. Ziggy was beating up Caveman, said Armpit. Then Zero started choking Zig Zag, and I had to pull Zero off of Zig Zag. It was all over before Mom fired his gun. They just got a little hot, that's all, said X-Ray. You know how it is in the sun all day. People get hot, right? But everything's cool now. I see, the warden said. She turned to Zig Zag. What's the matter? Didn't you get a puppy for your birthday? Zig's just a little hot, said X-Ray. Out in the sun all day, you know how it is. The blood starts to boil. Is that what happened, Zig Zag? Asked the warden. Yeah, said Zig Zag. Like X-Ray said, working so hard in the hot sun, while Caveman just sits around doing nothing, my blood boiled. Excuse me, said the warden. Caveman digs holes just like everyone else. Zig Zag shrugged. Sometimes. Excuse me? Zero's been digging part of Caveman's holes every day, said Squid. The warden looked from Squid to Stanley to Zero. I'm teaching him to read and write, said Stanley. It's sort of a trade. The hole still gets dug, so what does it matter who digs it? Excuse me, said the warden. Isn't it more important for him to learn to read, Stanley asked. Doesn't that build character more than digging holes? That's his character, said the warden. What about your character? Stanley raised and lowered one shoulder. The warden turned to Zero. Well, Zero, what have you learned so far? Zero said nothing. Have you just been digging caveman's holes for nothing? The warden asked. He likes to dig holes, said Mr. Pendanski. Tell me what you learned yesterday, said the warden. Surely you can remember that. Zero said nothing. Mr. Pendanski laughed. He picked up a shovel and said, You might as well try to teach this shovel to read. It's got more brains than Zero. The at sound, said Zero. The at sound, repeated the warden. Well then, tell me, what does C-A-T spell? Zero glanced around uneasily. Stanley knew that he knew the answer. Zero just didn't like answering questions. Cat, Zero said. Mr. Pendanski clapped his hands. Bravo, bravo, the boy's a genius. F-A-T, asked the warden. Zero thought a moment. Stanley hadn't taught him the F sound yet. F, Zero whispered. F-at, fat. How about H-A-T, asked the warden. Stanley hadn't taught him the H sound either. Zero concentrated hard, and then he said, chat. Oh, the counselors laughed. He's a genius, all right, said Mr. Pendanski. He's so stupid, he doesn't even know he's stupid. Stanley didn't know why Mr. Pendanski seemed to have it in for Zero. If Mr. Pendanski only thought about it, he'd realize that it was very logical for Zero to think that the H made a CH sound. Okay, from now on, I don't want anyone digging anyone else's holes, said the warden. No more reading lessons. I'm not digging another hole, said Zero. Good, said the warden.